Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks. Glad to be back. So this is episode 21, and we're recording this on October 30th, 2022.
On this episode, we report on China's 20th Party Congress, where Xi further consolidated his power. We will also look at China's more dismal assessment of the international strategic environment and whether the U.S. is going down the right path with its own industrial policy to counter China. As usual, there is a lot going on the Russia-Ukraine front, including Russia's attack on Ukraine's electrical grid. We then turn to Iran to discuss the resilience of their ongoing protests. The UK has a new prime minister. Will he bring stability to the politics there, and is that enough? Finally, Brazilians go to the polls today to vote for their next president, and we update you on the latest of this election. But first, let's see. Ryan is making me do this during sunlight hours, so I don't get to drink my usual cocktail, although you are drinking coffee and Baileys, right?
I am a little bit, even though I'm still a little bit on the clock too, but... You know, why not? That was half my training with Shell.
To drink and work on the clock?
No comment on that. But anyway, I mean, so we talked last time, you started your new job. You've been kind of in a training period for your first month, but over the last couple of weeks, you've been teaching your first classes at the National Defense University, which, got the opportunity to check out. It's pretty awesome. It's located on Fort McNair, so just south of the mall, kind of that area, DC. Yeah, it was really, really cool campus. So how have you enjoyed the teaching process so far?
First, I just want to say, taking your dad there, it was pretty amazing for me to watch too, because, it's hard to imagine going back someplace, although I can also see it not too long in our future, but going back someplace where you'd been 48 years ago, and all those memories. And I just thought it was really nice for me to watch him get to explore some of that.
Well, that's good. Yeah, no, I'm sure he appreciates that. And I know, yeah, he appreciated the visit a lot. I mean, he was stationed there with the Old Guard, which is the ceremonial unit. I think it's since moved to, I can't remember the name of the fort, but across the Potomac River in Virginia. But yeah, he had a lot of memories there and doing drills out in the big expansive field. It kind of is pretty close to where you teach.
Yeah, so I thought that was really neat. And as for teaching, I think it's going well. It's a totally different environment. So when you're teaching, I have 12 students and they're all type A, highly engaged sort of people. A lot of times you have trouble getting your international students into the discussion because they don't speak English as well. But both mine are very participatory. And so it makes it go by fast, and it's interesting, and it's always good when you can ask questions and people are really engaged in answering them and having a discussion about them.
So a little bit different than a lecture hall filled with 120 undergrads, so you're saying?
1,000 times different, which is part of why I was nervous, because it was like, I've never done this before. I can't even visualize it, and
right.
It's good when you have a class or two down, because then you're preparing, you kind of have an idea of what the flow of the class is going to be like and how they're going to respond to things. So
yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I guess it's on with the...
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Okay. So we decided to go in a slightly different order today, and we are going to begin with China, the one thing that everyone in the country, regardless of political stripes, can agree on in their antipathy towards China, I suppose. So what's been in the news is the 20th Party Congress. And the reason why this is important, once every 5 years, there's a Party Congress, and they decide who the next leaders are going to be and sort of what the plan for China is going to be over the next 5 years. And I think the debate over the next leaders was, will he choose purely loyalists, or will he try to have more consensus between the more economically sided part of the party, who's a little bit disturbed by the government's intervention into the private sector? And that question was answered. He dramatically chose loyalists. So there's a 7-person standing committee who have the most power next to Xi. And out is the current premier, Li Keqiang, and he was more one of the market-friendly reformers. So he's out. The other person who's out is Wang Yang, who was once seen as the possible successor to Li. And kind of to get a sense of their economic perspective, Li Keqiang actually won the top economics award for his doctoral dissertation in 1994, and Wang Yang was an architect of the free market economic boom in southeastern China. So that's where their perspective is. And it's kind of, it says a lot that she got rid of them. Also, was expected to be promoted to the standing committee was Hu Chenhua, who was the deputy prime minister, an ally of Mr. Li. And some thought that he might even be promoted to the premiership, which is essentially like the prime minister. But he was not only not promoted to the standing committee, but he was completely booted out of the Politburo. I should have said how to pronounce that. So again, as a symbol of loyalists, is the next premier will be Li Qiang, and he has been the party's leading man in Shanghai, obviously China's commercial hub. And what's controversial about this is the months-long lockdown Shanghai experienced, which did not go very well, and citizens are very unhappy about. And so the fact that Xi promoted him is sort of this consolidation around loyalists, and also a sense of the party not being as responsive as it used to be to citizens and their discontent. Also of note that there are no women on the Politburo for the first time in 25 years. So basically what we saw is China move even further to more of an authoritarian dictatorship, away from more of a party authoritarian-led country. And this has a lot of disturbing implications.
I mean, for China watchers such as yourself, I mean, did any of that come as a big surprise? I mean, were they expecting somebody like Lin Chuchang, who had kind of the more market-friendly policies to succeed, or was this kind of all expected, that it would be strictly loyalist, that the whole idea of kind of a meritocracy around competence, that would be thrown out the window for Xi loyalists?
Yeah, I'm not so much a domestic politics person, but my sense in reading before and after the Congress is people just didn't know. I don't know that there was an expectation either way. There was a sense that she would go one way or the other, but no one, I mean, obviously people are disappointed in the role that he took, but I don't think there was a lot of people who knew for sure, had a strong expectation of which way it would go. Probably a little bit leaning more toward the loyalists, but I think people were just still really hopeful that the technocrats would still have some role there.
And looking ahead, I mean, obviously he, in taking this unprecedented third term, or beyond 3 terms. Is this his third term?
This is his third term.
Yeah, this is his third term. And staking out essentially a claim for life. But still, they like to groom somebody as a successor. Did anybody emerge out of that select 7 in the standing committee as the likely person that he's grooming to be his successor, or is it?
That was another surprise. I think that was probably one of the bigger surprises, is that he did not have anyone in there that is groomed to be his successor. So there's no signs of a successor. And people really expected, to find someone in the standing committee who might be groomed for that role. Yeah. So that's another sign people took of the sort of personalistic consolidation.
Right.
But even then, you'd still think maybe some successor. But anyway, that was also a big surprise for people. That was probably one of the biggest surprises. So last Wednesday, I went to a talk by Susan Shirk, who's one of the big China watchers. She does a lot of domestic politics, but has a lot of great books and scholarship on China, many of them which are also popular books to read. And she actually has served in government. I hadn't known that. So she has an article out where she was talking about how notable, how unusual it is that he's concentrated more power in his hands than any leader since Mao Zedong. So much so that he's called the chairman of everything. I think one thing I think she points out, or it was a different article, is how this goes against Deng Xiaoping's vision for China, where he survived many reformist attempts during Mao Zedong. And when he became the leader of China, he's the one who kind of opened it slowly to private capitalism. But also, he was trying to design a party that would not have another Mao Zedong, that power wouldn't be concentrated in the hands of one person, but that party institutions rule. I mean, he wasn't for democracy, but he thought more of the party should have, institutions that are strong to prevent power just being in one person's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So
probably from all the purges he suffered under Mao.
Right.
Yeah.
And China had stayed on that trajectory until Xi, and now is definitely going in the direction that Deng Xiaoping wanted to avoid. But it turned out the institutions were not strong enough to prevent the sort of strongman from arising, which, is kind of an international trend of institutions that are supposed to prevent, certain types of leaders not really living up to that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, what's your perspective on how he accomplished that? I know a lot of it seemed to be around this anti-corruption campaign, which was, obviously there was a lot of corruption going on, as his predecessor, Hu Jintao, kind of really opened up the economy, encouraged entrepreneurship. You also had a lot of government leaders, through graft and whatnot, getting pretty wealthy, becoming centers of power themselves. And I feel like I remember reading one research paper that looked at who was being targeted by Xi in relation to their connections within his network. And it was clearly, there was obviously corruption going on, but he was targeting his political enemies and adversaries very much in that process. Is that really how he consolidated power effectively, by framing it as this anti-corruption push against elites?
It's funny because in the beginning of it happening, there's a talk at UCLA with a research paper that kind of said the opposite, that said that was sort of the assumption, but when they looked at the data, it wasn't concentrated on enemies, but was more focused on legitimate corruption. But obviously, this is how he ended up consolidating his power. I don't know that it was specifically to go necessarily after his enemies. I mean, it did genuinely take out some of the most corrupt officials in the Communist Party and did really clean it up a lot. But it is also how he ended up consolidating power. I think the biggest thing is he didn't allow his friends necessarily to participate in the corruption, right? He didn't give them a pass, but he definitely went after and focused more on any challenges to his authority and power. And in fact, the anti-corruption campaign has kind of died down. And then right before the party congress, 2 party members were removed for corruption. And people were kind of a little surprised by that power play. So that definitely was one of the instruments of doing so. Not the only one, but certainly an important instrument that she was able to use. And I think people were wary of what was happening at the time, but I don't know that people thought that it would end up at this point. So the things about Xi that really kind of goes against what China's economic miracle has been, which is the more state-led, central-controlled economy. Although I do want to point out that 80% of the Chinese economy is still private enterprise. And what people focus on is the government trying to have closer ties to certain businesses, and that's definitely true. And, well, one of the biggest things that he did was an unexpected and abrupt crackdown on the major internet companies last year. And part of this was because basically unequal access to certain forms of education. And, China has a huge inequality problem. And so Xi has been really focused on trying to reduce inequality and more diverse forms of inclusion, which means taking away a lot of advantages of the upper middle class families. And his part of the plan was partly to redistribute wealth and rein in the private sector. Now, obviously, these are also the families that have the most power. And and their dissent to these sort of things made Xi pull back on the burner for now. So it isn't like he has absolute power, obviously, and it isn't that he can just do whatever he wants. And I think that is particularly true if it seems to threaten too much of China's economy. But he is certainly taking actions, as I will talk a little bit later, that sort of might be undermining China's economic miracle. So one of the things that kind of resulted from this that she mentioned in the article, but she also mentioned at the talk I went to, is that sort of this crackdown meant that these companies laid off a lot of employees and are not hiring. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, unemployment has become a serious problem for the party. Youth unemployment is at a record 20%. And that is just something you have not seen with China's economic miracle since the 2000s. So this creates, obviously, political risk in just this widespread discontentment. And you have young people, right? Young people with a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean,
on
a lot
their
of it's college educated too. I mean, it's that combination of high unemployment, college educated, that's the foment of a lot of revolutions. And
yeah, and I think some of the ideological program of Xi is also really trying to address this problem too. So he really has engaged in reviving, at least in name, a lot of Mao Zedong sort of ideology. And this has been really focused on these younger people and these college graduates. And this focus on tackling inequality is something that they definitely support.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of I think there was an article in either The Atlantic or Vox that went into kind of the major influences of Xi in terms of his ideological focus. And one of those, which is, well known, the fall of the Soviet Union having such a impact on that generation of China's leaders. And the lesson that he took away from it was that Gorbachev engaged in glasnost, so the idea of openness to Western ideas too early, rather than that the Soviet state was a corrupt husk of its former self and basically nothing holding it up. But from that, he was like, yeah, we have to double down. That's why the focus on censorship, the focus on ideological or returning to Maoist, Marxist roots of thought and, the propaganda and the political training, that being emphasized for the first time since Mao, really.
Right. I mean, because Deng definitely wanted to get away from a lot of that. Because he had been the victim of those purges so often.
Right.
Yeah. And then I was reading too about the way that in this museum and stuff, Xi is really sort of making himself out to be like the successor and equal of Mao Zedong, in this sort of party mythology. And again, that really goes to all the signs of him becoming a more personalist dictator.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, he has his own book of thoughts out now. And
so they did have to cut back on that because people did not react very well to his little red book.
Yeah, I don't get in the 21st century to go back to, this sort of kind of crude, just kind of crude mid-20th century propaganda techniques.
Yeah.
Instead of, I don't know, coming up with memes and viral videos and TikToks. I don't know. I mean, they invented TikTok. He should be out there doing that sort of propaganda to reach the young people, not a dumb version of the Red Book again. I mean, it's been 60, 70 years, right?
Yeah. I think, and people still have really bad memories of the Cultural Revolution. And so that's why there was a lot of pushback because of the chaos that introduced into society. So yeah, it is interesting that he's trying to go back to that. Obviously, they are using pop culture and have for a while. I mean, movies and things of that nature.
Yeah. I mean, the Wolf Warrior series, which again is that sort of where you have the private sector coming in with the government. And that's effective. That's like a modern way of thinking. I think of the other memes that they've done, but the only one that's coming to mind is that the badass Biden one where he's on a Iron Throne. It was actually picked up and used for Dark Brandon. But so I think some of that
Chinese, kind of over my head because I don't see a lot of
Chinese propaganda. They're still not quite adept at it yet, I think.
Well, you have to also understand, I mean, the country is run by very old people, right?
Yeah.
That was the
Yeah,
thing
they
about
need
the
some
standing
young
committee
social media
is that
people on the
all of the people elected are just way too old to become Xi's successor, right? And
Right.
so, he got rid of automatic retirement age.
Yeah.
And so you have, more older people in power. Yeah. So that aspect is definitely there and concerning. But we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I think that's the thing that's always interesting about the Chinese system is that, there has to be a contract with society. I mean, too much discontent definitely threatens the party. And that's why the party before Xi had been more responsive, and it seemed to be on the track of going more responsive to citizens' concerns.
Yeah. So I'm curious, were there any signals around their COVID policy? Because that's probably the most controversial, both from kind of economic and openness and also unpopular, at least, the way it was executed in Shanghai. Are they keeping that up? You see that? I mean, did they make any pronouncements around that where zero COVID is still seen as a core goal for party legitimacy?
Yeah. So another surprise was that there was no sign that they're going to end their zero COVID policy. A lot of people thought that they would try, especially with some of their economic problems, that you would see some signal of how China might be moving beyond the zero COVID policy and kind of treat it like the rest of the countries which have just moved on from the pandemic. But I think, in the articles I read, I think didn't also though really address the fact that, the Western countries developed countries have been able to move on because of the strains, while more contagious, are more mild and that they have strong vaccination programs.
Right.
Whereas China does not have that sort of vaccination program. And so I still think that Xi bets on stability, and with all the discontent and economic problems that it's led to, I think he fears that if COVID were allowed to spread, then it would overwhelm hospitals because there's no way to prevent it from spreading in the same way that vaccines have helped, slow down at least the hospitalizations, right? So actually, I mean, we have huge numbers of people getting infected, but, not huge numbers going to the hospital. And that's because of the vaccinations. But if you don't have that basis, because the Chinese vaccine was not very good and they haven't opened up to any sort of foreign vaccines and such, is my understanding.
So unless they develop their own mRNA vaccine domestically, they're going to take this policy of lockdown.
I kind of don't know if they have another choice, because widespread instability due to that, I think, is worse for them than any economic costs.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you accept a EU or US vaccine, you admit ideological defeat.
Yeah.
Your system's inferior.
Yeah. So I've given this a lot of thought because Shanghai kind of surprised me in the sense that, not the cruelty of Shanghai, but the fact that they are willing to risk the economics of this hub. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why, because things are not as clear energy. This economic miracle, the economy is still part of the foundational contract. And, why would they jeopardize that? But then I was thinking, well, if everybody in Shanghai gets COVID and you overwhelm the hospitals and you see people dying, then that's worse for the economy and then worse for stability. That's certainly my take on it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I mean, she has deep roots in Shanghai, right? That's where he worked with, who did you mention that he promoted recently?
Li Qiang.
Yeah, because I know they worked closely together when they were both based in Shanghai. So it's kind of even more of a mixed, being the home region for Xi.
A lot of people, I mean, if there was a surprise, there was a lot of people surprised that he rose to be the second in power premier when he's so unpopular.
Right.
And the Shanghai did not go well.
Yeah.
And on the sort of social contract, one thing that people were mentioning, and I do find slightly worrisome, instead of focusing on economic gains Xi seems to be trying to create a new contract that focuses on stability and projections of Chinese strength. Whereas, obviously stability has always been important, but the economy, promising economic wealth was always more important. And now Xi seems to be backing away from that. In some sense, China's already led, that huge path of people out of poverty. And in the current situation, people are not in the generation going from that stark poverty to middle class. So in some sense, no one mentioned that, but that certainly could be part of why Xi feels like there needs to be a new social contract.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense to reset expectations around that, particularly given they're in the middle of a real estate bust as well, which is the majority of Chinese wealth is tied up in real estate. So if you recenter it to the economy and personal wealth and maybe focus on inequality, then you're less likely to take the losses because you've reached that demographic peak too, given the low replacement rate and the aging population. Yeah, most economists now think the Chinese economy won't surpass the U.S. until the 2030s, if ever, based on the current path.
Yeah, which is kind of amazing given all the hype about it would be next year. So always people do still emphasize purchasing power parity, but I think that's not the same as absolute numbers. And it's also surprising just because of how many more people China has. You would expect the economy just from that perspective.
4 times as many people, yeah.
But the one thing that people point out is you have to be careful to not overestimate China's economic problems. Sometimes in the West, that's it's been tempting to say, oh, this is peak China, but there's no real basis for that. So I think always is that balance between acknowledging there are economic problems for sure. And Xi may be responsible for some of them, but that doesn't mean that China's just going to be in a downhill trajectory from now. They definitely will still grow their economy and grow their economic influence. But the focus on stability is a classic dictator move, right? That's the number one thing they usually promise to the people is stability. So again, all these trends toward a personalist dictatorship, which is just something that is pretty unforeseen in China, given the way of the structure, is certainly disturbing. On the other hand, like I said, you can go too far because he is still a pragmatist, right? When the internet tech sector declined after he had that crackdown, he withdrew a lot of his plans. He backed down, right? He's not going to pursue his agenda like the way Mao pursued it, despite, the economic class. He is still a pragmatist. It's just that now you don't have those private enterprise people really being able to, there's no voices to say, well, what about this? Maybe that idea is not completely correct. And now it's all just purely yes men. So it'd be interesting to see if this changes his assessment of what's going on in his path to it. One thing Shirk also said is something that I think over and over again, I believe and hear from China watchers and China analysts, because she's like, look, I have a lot of antipathy for the Xi regime. She's like, but we still need diplomacy. And she's like, I feel like the problem is we've given up on diplomacy and we haven't had real diplomacy for 6 years, and that we can't just feel like there's no places where we can find any cooperation on. But both countries are more and more acting like that there are no areas of cooperation. They're just going to be this, competition.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the problem. I think that problem on both sides. And I think, it's kind of disturbing the way the U.S. and China's relations are now just kind of almost tit for tat or, reactionary to each other. Instead of, this idea of, in the beginning, Biden, made some words to let's find some cooperative areas. And the Chinese have been saying that as well. But now there's just the sense of, no, we're just, the U.S. is just out to get us. And, and then from the U.S., that China just takes advantage of us and it's not creating any room for diplomacy. And that itself is pretty dangerous. But her perspective is there should be room for diplomacy. And if it's not, we should at least try it. Maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe China's so hardened that they would refuse to cooperate. But we haven't made significant overtures in that manner.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I read recently that was related to that and kind of this, to your point, kind of the lack of cooperation or agreement between the two countries was on LNG exports, where China is interested and wants, even more natural gas from the United States. But you've seen pushback from members of Congress, I think primarily on the Republican side, on those sales. So actually intervening and preventing additional natural gas shipments to China for the strategic, which is insane for multiple reasons. One, the one area we should definitely cooperate with China is around climate change and climate mitigation, and taking those coal plants that they've had to turn back on by providing natural gas is certainly in our interest. And then obviously economically, very much in our interest. And then two, tying them more dependent on U.S. energy, that's a good thing strategically.
I can't even think of why you would feel that that's negative, like militarily or any. I mean,
that's why it was definitely bewildering. But that, I think it's just a testament to how much the anti-China sentiment has taken over, that doing any business with China, even if it's to your strategic and economic benefit, you would push back on. So it's a little bit crazy. So I think maybe that's just the environment that we've now reached.
Yeah. And she said she thought that at this point, that environment, that everything's a complete overreaction to the threat of China's. And I think it's economic and military. There's a lot of alarmism. And in a certain sense, we have lost our confidence in our own strengths, which we talked about. But also that sense of, okay, we're not going to do any business, even if it's in our strategic interest, which is just a really harmful perspective.
Right.
Just real briefly, as I sort of mentioned before, one thing that did surprise people was really notable that certain phrases that China has used for the last few decades about this is a strategic opportunity for growth and continued development for China has now been replaced for a much darker period and was sort of replaced with that we're entering a period of strategic opportunities, risks, and challenges, and that we must be prepared to deal with worst case scenarios. So this lack of phrase of strategic, just saying strategic opportunity period to the darker, which is now using phrases such as ensuring both development and security. Security was mentioned like 90 times as opposed to the last Party Congress report, which was like 60 times. So there's a lot more emphasis on China needing more security in sort of the international environment. One thing that was also interesting to me is as part of that was taking actions there's a need for take actions like countering sanctions, stockpiling food, energy resources, ensuring supply chain security, and also raising the overall public awareness of these threats. And basically, I'm teaching a class on industrial mobilization, and these are the things that the U.S. is very sort of focusing on itself in mobilization that, in case we were attacked, then do we have, enough energy resources? Do we have enough weapons that could survive attrition? How would we be able to still make things in supply chain security? And so it's sort of interesting the Chinese having that similar response. And on one hand, people argue that could be deterrence, but it also can be a sign of aggression. And I think it's continuously this sort of dangerous moment where we're constantly responding to each other as our biggest threats. So I thought, some of it is an accurate assessment, but some of it, as we're seeing, can lead to, again, I just feel like the US and China could start being engaged in this like cyclical, I guess that's why people say maybe new Cold War, where they just continuously focus on each other as a threat and try to up their sense of mobilization for war and preparation for war, which doesn't mean that you're preparing to attack the other country. So I think that's really important. But to see this sort of not arms race, but mobilization rates, like learning the lessons from the previous wars. So I thought that's kind of depressing. Significantly, there was nothing new on Taiwan, and it was not mentioned or included in the 2027 or 2035 goals. So nothing has really changed there. Switching to, sort of our own industrial mobilization, one thing that really struck me by reading a Fareed Zakaria article a few days ago was sort of, we look at China's economic success that has been based on different principles. And this industrial policy of China, we assume that that's part of China's economic success, but it's really relatively new and could be undermining Chinese economic expansion. And so is it really a good idea for us to abandon our typical free market approach to just responding to China with our own industrial policy?
Yeah, no, I like that Zakaria piece too. I didn't entirely agree with kind of the analogy to Japan, because it was the last time we had sort of an industrial policy. But yeah, the analogs, the idea of, in 1990, everybody was so focused when Japan had absolute peak of its market. I think on the real estate side, Tokyo real estate was worth more than all of California. It was just this period kind of built around this fear. And of course, the Ministry of MIDI, I can't remember that, Ministry of Industry and Technology. Mm-hmm. But essentially, it was this central planning agency that directed Japanese investments in research and development. But it was this big industry. And a lot of people were like, hey, we got to emulate this in order to compete. So, I like that idea of, we've had this history of alarmism, but they're not quite the same either, just because of the scale of China, the ideological differences. But, I thought that part was refreshing. And then the idea of, maybe industrial policy isn't going to be successful in China. They're putting a lot of R&D into things like quantum computing and sort of these next edge sort of technologies, but is government-led direction really to take, especially as they're cracking down on private sector innovation, private equity, and things like that. I think, in some of the pieces I read, it's still a mix where it's, government funds going into, but the market is ultimately decides who the winners are within this technological competition within China.
Which is sort of the model the U.S. is following too.
Right, yeah.
In many respects. And so the point was that we attribute this industrial policy as part of China's economic success, and it may be really hurting its economic growth potential.
Yeah, and it's, it is a complicated, because we ourselves point to the government investments in early research, and maybe this is different than industrial policy, but obviously like the internet, all this sort of core stuff that maybe the Department of Defense invested in that later became, entire sectors within the economy. So there's a distinction, right, between kind of fundamental research and development and industrial policy. Where am I getting those confused?
Right. No, I think some parts of industrial policy that people point to is certainly the subsidies to finance the building of the semiconductor factories. Like, that's not just money for research, although there was a lot of money, but the actual building of the factories or certain subsidies to build them.
Right.
Essentially the same thing. The sort of export restrictions are definitely industrial policy.
Yeah.
That we now have on certain types of semiconductor, The Economist. And then when you take in like the green energy program and the Inflation Reduction Bill, it makes the U.S. one of the most state interventionist economies in the Western world, far more than France, which is normally takes that. And in fact, there's a lot of reaction. So one of the principles of that is that U.S. consumers get subsidies if they buy American electric cars, which then has Europe and South Korea furious.
Well, assembled in North America.
Right.
So they could be a Toyota manufacturer,
right. That is true.
But as long as they're built in Tennessee, you're still getting that. But if it's built in Japan, you're not getting that subsidy.
And they do still sell cars built in these.
Yeah.
It violates the trade organization rules that we belong to.
WTO, yeah,
right. Because
yeah.
you're not supposed to discriminate against other nations. You're supposed to allow them to compete in your own market. And France and Germany, who've had a lot of tensions lately, continue to do so, are pretty united in threatening to have retaliatory sanctions on the United States if we go ahead and do this. It's a huge violation of sort of the free market World Trade Organization that we set up, and just part of where this economic nationalism may be going too far.
Yeah. I found that really surprising. I wasn't aware of those provisions within the IRA that really focused on kind of that American sourced. Because in my mind, I'm like, yeah, I get the anti-China, but we should be supporting our allies.
Mm-hmm.
So the allies should be included within it. Mm-hmm. But instead, it was this very nationalist, Trump-like sort of provisions. And I've definitely seen, there's a lot of criticisms from the Republican side on that, because they did support certain components of the IRA. But I know on the regulatory side, a lot of it was also...
But they didn't like a lot of the green energy period.
Well, yeah, they didn't like that component. They didn't like some of the additional regulations, which favored minority and women in terms of some of the subsidies. But the economists mentioned that too, as kind of an inefficiency and creates a lot of paperwork within the markets as well. So it'll be interesting to see, not that they could do it even if they take back the House, but what elements of this bill they would seek to reform.
Yeah, I think the U.S. is now, trying to sit down with the EU and sit down with South Korea to address their concerns. So it's hard to see if they stick to this very strictly, that how they will do that. So I feel like there will have to be some compromise on this.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. One thing, going back to almost the China semiconductor part, is one thing I felt that was interesting, and they said a novel step, is the way that American U.S. persons are, including American factories, but also those who work in foreign factories overseas, cannot be involved in the production of advanced chips in China. So one of the consequences of this is you had international companies and American companies saying they're not all run by Americans, right? Even American companies, but all the Americans had to stop work completely until they figured out the exact regulations. This could be a problem because then these are especially the international companies who this is where their main violation is of the rules, may just fire and not hire any more Americans, but still continue their role in advanced chip manufacturing in China. But that was pretty extreme and something I hadn't known about the export ban or that particular part of it.
Yeah.
So I think, though, the economic nationalism is problematic. I think we're definitely going too far on that. I agree in general that whenever we talk about China competition, this is what drives me crazy. We never include our allies. When we talk about mobilization or how we need to be prepared, we act like the U.S. can do this alone. And in conflicts, who your allies are often determinative if you win or lose conflicts. You can just see that in Ukraine, right? Russia couldn't have anticipated the type of resistance Ukraine has because it didn't anticipate the amount of military support and weapons and supplies that the West would give Ukraine.
Yeah, so it is surprising. I get that Congress, in crafting that bill, had different drivers than maybe necessarily what the White House and our relations with other countries would. But given the success, we've had in rebuilding kind of alliances, particularly around Ukraine, but also around changing sentiment against China within these countries, that we would kind of step on our own feet around something fundamental like this, given the amount of money at stake and the importance to battling climate change, that this wouldn't be, take into account our allies' interest as well.
Yeah. And speaking of the unification of our allies with China, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that were happening in Germany that were pretty controversial this week. Is that government gave approval for a Chinese takeover of a German chip plant. So while we're trying to have all these semiconductor rules in the US and trying to create them where our allies have to cooperate, I just thought this was really notable. And like I said, it was controversial through Europe and the United States that they would just allow Chinese to completely take over this German plant. And then also controversial is that they gave the green light to the Chinese state shipping giant Costco for buying a foothold in the container port of Hamburg. The compromise was that originally Costco was going to get a 35% stake, and now it's like a 22% stake. But again, something that everyone reacted quite strongly to. So Germany, I think, is really bad at following security externalities, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So they ignored warnings about relying on Russian energy. And now, I mean, even within their own government agencies, they opposed both of these moves. And the German government.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Several agencies.
Wow.
The spy chief was particularly against the takeover of the German plant for being able to kind of steal the engineering there.
Yeah.
And then several different ministries opposed the buying into the shipping harbor.
Yeah, that's disappointing. But yeah, and I saw similar headlines where it's just, on economic matters. And I don't know if this is a function of the German economy kind of suffering under, its current situation with high energy prices, that it feels like more than now than ever, it needs to have a cheap source of, markets, one, for its high-end goods, and two, cheap sources of other inputs into its manufacturing that it can't afford to isolate China to the extent that the U.S. would like to see.
So also interesting that, we'll get more of a sense of this. Germany's leader, Scholz, is going to visit China this week or next week. I had trouble figuring out exactly, and is expected to meet with Xi. So I guess we'll find out more about where that relationship is going.
Is that the first time a Western leader has gone to China in a long time since COVID?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Scholz is the front. Well, that tells you a lot, probably.
So we should have more on that. All right. That was a lot of China, but I felt like it was good. There's a lot going on, especially with the Party Congress.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that was the big political event of the year. So it's important to cover that in depth for sure.
All right. On to our normal update of Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah. So I think on our last podcast, the Ukraine had just delivered a strike on the Crimean Bridge, and there's a lot of celebration around that. It was timed with Putin's birthday. Since then, there's been a pretty significant counteroffensive that the Russians have launched. First, I think following that next week, that Monday, a series of cruise missile strikes from the Black Sea Fleet that targeted the Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly their electrical facilities. But they've continued these assaults. So it seems like a new strategy leading up to the winter to specifically target electrical facilities, to the extent that the current estimates put the loss of electric power at around 30% countrywide. And Kyiv's mayor announced last Friday that the blackouts could worsen as energy supplies within the capital are down 50% compared to pre-war levels. So this is it's been a heavy blow, I think, to Ukraine. They have managed to push back against that. But I think the biggest thing is a new focus on air defense support for them. And this is largely driven by the fact that Russians are running low on supplies, from the effects of sanctions. They're certainly running low on the number of cruise missiles they have. So they had turned to Iran. They made a deal, particularly around drone purchases, of which they've ordered 2,400. And it's really what their Ukrainian cities are seeing are these kamikaze drones, of which I think 300 or so sorties have been launched in the last couple of weeks. And they've been real effective in targeting electrical infrastructure as well as civilian targets.
Someone pointed out, though, that kamikaze seems to be the wrong term if no person is involved.
If no person is going to commit, yeah.
Anyway.
So I guess it's just a distinction from, kind of the drones we deploy that are armed with air-to-surface missiles and things like that. So I think this has been a real challenge for U.S. and NATO allies to deal with. And the Wall Street Journal really reported. And it's just the complexity of having a successful air defense. It's really this integration of all these sensors between radar and cameras and radio frequency scanners, and then coordinating that with the air defense system in place. Now, unfortunately, Ukraine has a real hodgepodge of air defense systems. So most of it are these big S-300 anti-aircraft missile systems. Then you have the Stingers, so the shoulder-fired missiles, and then machine guns and individual jets. So it's just very hard to integrate all these different systems from different countries into a single source. And it's something that the U.S. apparently and its NATO allies haven't invested a lot in, because it always thought in any sort of conflict it's engaging in, the goal is air superiority. Mm-hmm. And they felt pretty assured because they've invested so much in their air mm-hmm. forces and being able to achieve air superiority. So I think this is a real challenge. And then, the cost of it. So the cost of these drones that were purchased from Iran are only $20,000. And they require relatively little training. That's the other controversial thing, is Iran has sent its own, trainers up to Russia and are training Russians on, how to pilot these drones. But Ukraine could spend, if it uses one of those missiles, it's spending up to $3 million to neutralize one of these. So it's kind of this cost. And it's kind of interesting because obviously the U.S. introduced drone warfare. And, that was definitely has been controversial in how the U.S. has used it and targeting. But this is the one where you really have, pretty massive drone deployment. And then what are the defensive systems for doing it? Because, they have single drones, but they're also doing swarms. And mm-hmm. swarms can actually overwhelm air defense systems, even if you have them in place. So I think it's a real challenge that the U.S. and NATO are trying to meet, coming up ahead. But I think Kiev's getting additional systems. They're trying to protect the capital as much as possible. But given the damage to the electrical infrastructure, it's going to be tough, especially as they begin to mount the offensive on Kherson, which was the other development. You saw Russian forces seeming to retreat from that. So it's almost like they know that they're going to lose that city. But actually, a Institute for the Study of War report came out that there was expectation that the Russians would target this huge hydroelectrical dam in the area, which one would flood portion of that area since it blocks the Dnipro River, but also could affect that nuclear plant. So the Zaporizhia mm-hmm. nuclear plant, because they use the water from that dam for cooling the nuclear reactor. So it's definitely an area to look. I think that's the expectation prior to when winter really sets in, is that there'll be a push to take Kherson back mm-hmm. before then. So then, you could definitely have these sort of actions coming up. Moving on, so Ukraine's obviously dealing with energy shortfall. Meanwhile, in the EU, the conditions have gotten considerably better since I think the last time that we talked about it. So EU originally had a goal on its natural gas of having 80% capacity of its storage prior to the winter. And continent-wide, it's actually up to 94%. And Germany's pretty much maxed it out at 98%. And it really just reflects the willingness of the EU to pay almost any price for LNG supplies. And we've talked about before, part of it's freed up because of China's COVID policy, right, because of China's willingness to switch on coal plants. This LNG has been available as long as you're willing to pay for it. So that's helped EU, combined with the fact that October has been unusually warm in Europe, that they've been able to bring up the supplies to the point where even the losses of Russian gas from Nord Stream, from the sabotage there, shouldn't affect Europe. Mind you, unless there's a very severe winter, they should be in relatively good shape. To the point where you actually saw negative spot prices during the week, just because it was unexpected that, one, you'd have this very warm weather in October, and two, that capacity levels for all these storage sites would be so high. So unfortunately, none of this translates into real price relief for the consumer. All natural gas is kind of long-term price. But in terms of shortages, in terms of the whole painful debate we talked about of industries having to shut down and which EU country would have to bear that burden, that's looking less and less likely. That being said, Germany's still feeling it. Prices are still 7 times higher than last winter. So you had another industry, it's a big chemical company, BASF, officially announcing that they were going to have to close down their presence or a large portion of their presence in Europe due to high gas prices, with their costs being nearly $2 billion a year higher.
Right. That's a good point.
So yeah, so that's relatively good from a supply side. Again, consumers are still going to suffer. And then the final update was on Putin's think tank speech that he delivered. So this was at the Valday Discussion Club in Moscow. And it's something that Western researchers and leaders used to attend. So in fact, Dan Dresner attended in 2016. He really described Valday as a swanky high-level conference put on by the Russian elite. And it's really the highest profile Russian equivalent to Davos. So it went ahead this year without Western attendance, did have leaders from Asia, so from India, Pakistan, and China, and Indonesia. And in terms of the messaging, it was useful seeing how Putin was framing it, particularly around his appeals to the far right within the West. It started off as really covered a lot of the talking points that he's covered for more than a decade, that Russia is a champion of rising nations in this new multipolar world, that Russia stands as a defender of traditional Christian values as society has lost its way. But the part that I found interesting was the feedback loop that exists between Putin and the far right in the US and in Europe around language use and the terms. So in this speech is really the first time, Putin is sending as clear a signal as possible to his allies in the West, talking about cancel culture, talking about gay parades, talking about gender identity. I thought Tom Nichols in his piece in The Atlantic really described the whole cancel culture concern. Putin framed it with like a Russian twist to it. But there were a few, ultimately were discussions. So one Italian university and briefly the Boston Pops over the 4th of July talked about, not including the works of Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky. Oh, sorry, I didn't pronounce that right.
I don't know. I know it's not pronounced that way.
The composer, the famous Russian composer, the 1812 overture.
And
all this, they ultimately didn't ban or they backed away from. But Putin's been using it as, oh, look, the West is trying to cancel all of Russian culture and things like that. But and then the idea again along those same lights basically sounds like a Tucker Carlson piece. And of course, we all know Tucker gets broadcast on Russian state media all the time. But it's, all the problems are due to this cosmopolitan neoliberal elites and trying to appeal, Putin's appealing to the good people of the West that, we've got to stand up for these traditional Christian values about freedom and patriotism. So he's gotten rid of the dog whistle and is basically just using the same language.
One of the things that I read on Twitter was that we should ban Russia's access to the far right media so they can't just steal the talking points.
Yeah. It's just like reinforcing.
So they can't have Newsmax or
Newsmax, Fox, Opinion Hour, all that.
Yeah, I thought that was a good take.
Yeah, no, for sure. So really, ultimately, it just represents another front in the war. Really, it may be a mark of desperation they has to turn to this, but I think it's effective in a lot of ways to really break Western unity around support for Ukraine. You've seen sort of gaps. I think the things that have emerged recently in the past couple of weeks. So the Italian leader we talked about last time, the far-right party that won the parliamentary elections there. One of the core components of this coalition is our good friend Berlusconi. So he got caught in a recorded audio tape talking with party members, talking about the sweet letters that he and Putin exchanged. I don't know what it is with letters and autocrats. Same thing with Trump. They're sending themselves love letters all the time.
I want to read these letters. We never got to see the letters between Trump and
Kim Jong-un.
They haven't been able to find them.
Yeah. That's super secret.
I want to see what they write to each other.
Anyway, it obviously sits in a very close place in his heart. But I think that the key controversy that came out here is he was very explicit in blaming Ukraine for the war, that Putin was just protecting native Russians, that he was forced into this. So Berlusconi's governing coalition actually had to do a lot of damage control coming out of that, because they won on the basis that they're going to govern from the center, that, remember, they have a lot of money at stake in terms of EU relief. So this was a huge embarrassment. I mean, big surprise that 86-year-old Berlusconi is saying whatever he wants and loves Putin. So maybe not a crack there. We'll see. And then in the U.S., I think you saw a couple events around. One was the release of a letter from the Progressive Caucus, headed up by House Representative Pamela Jayapal. They were almost immediately forced to back down because the letter appeared to advocate for isolationism and direct negotiations with Putin. So the Democrat leadership really cracked down on that, and they withdrew that. But then the other one of more concern was likely future Speaker of the House following the midterms and expected Republican victories. Kevin McCarthy came out and questioned future aid and the need to rein in spending in times of a recession. I think it was just really endemic to the fact that you have a coalition of mostly America First, Trumpist Republicans on the House side that are likely to come in this election, that have voiced very strongly anti-Ukrainian, more from the perspective of, we can't afford this. Why are we getting involved in certain affairs? They're beginning to fund. I was surprised to see during the World Series, there was an ad from, I can't remember the name of the PAC, but essentially it was a far-right backed ad that was saying, we're bringing about Armageddon and nuclear war through the support of the Ukraine. Somebody has to, cut them off of money. But the fact that you're seeing that publicly, you're seeing this kind of from big money groups, and you're seeing it supported from candidates like Blake Masters and J.D. Vance on the Senate side, who will, it's a toss-up for both of those races, but at least several of them are win, showing that Putin's overall strategy of attempting to influence these elections and kind of break the unity of the West is a viable strategy.
I think people have been sort of waiting for this to emerge for a long time and thought maybe it wouldn't emerge until after the elections because of how sympathetic the far right has been to Putin the whole time. And so that's why I think it's really notable, Kevin McCarthy's statements, right? Because even though the far right is pretty the mainstream of the Republican Party, Kevin McCarthy has certainly been the sort of representative of the party. And so when he starts saying things like that, it indicates a clear direction. So Putin's been hoping for this.
It's a large enough part of the Republican caucus that he doesn't feel like he can ignore it. I don't know within his own district, probably constituents might push back enough on it. I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely a concern. It's creating a lot of concern in European capitals on future support, because obviously the House alone can hold up any future provisions.
Right. What's crazy to me is how unified people are on China, who has not started a war, whereas there's so much split on Russia, which did start a war.
Right. Yeah.
And I think Dan Nixon had a Twitter thread. He's a famous IR scholar, or a well-known IR scholar, and was just talking about, war typically ends with negotiations. The problem with negotiations right now is that Putin gets to claim still a lot of territory if the war was going to end now. Exactly, and, we don't want to reward Russia with a victory. So, and he was responding more to the progressives. I think everyone's disturbed by the right, and that they're already, before the elections are even held, indicating what you think would not be a popular mainstream reaction, but they don't seem to be too worried about maybe not continuing to give Ukraine aid in the future, which would be very detrimental to their ability to continue to resist Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very concerning. And there's a split between McCarthy and McConnell because McConnell came out saying, I know this is the yeah, it's funny where McConnell is like the
He always loses.
anti-Trumpist.
He always loses. I don't even say anti-Trumpist. I think McConnell is the old school. He's still the old school Republican Party.
Establishment, yeah.
Yeah, not as much as like some of them are, like Romney, but more the old win at any cost, but then is like, but I can't deal with this far right trend.
Right.
But McConnell's been continuously on the losing end of that.
Yeah.
So I don't really see him being able to stop Republicans from cutting off aid, which, like I said, be hugely detrimental.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely against our national interest as well. But, we'll see how this materializes. Not great signaling at all.
Yeah, really disturbing.
Yeah.
So I have a few quick topics that we wanted to end with. The first of these I just have been really wanting to mention is the Iranian protests. So most protests like these, rise up. We're used to having protests last for like a couple of weeks or a month, but it's really striking that the protests continue to grow and have been now for more than 40 days. And that's despite increasingly harsh crackdowns, which include live fire into crowds. So several people have died from that. One of the articles I read called it the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since its inception. And just once again, to just note how different this is sort of than from the other uprisings that we've seen and the Green Movement and others, where you have large protests, mostly of young men. And like I said, they're very intense for a couple of weeks to a month, but the sort of enduring power of this and the imagery is completely different because these are being led by women and younger people. And so one of the things that had prevented some of these tactics before was the idea of, these people firing on women, and killing women, which is very different. But so the party is very frustrated at the inability to suppress these protests. And like I said, it's not just firing into the crowds, but they have been arresting a lot of people. People have been dying in custody. They're using pretty harsh tactics. But now it's expected that they will use even harsher tactics because as of yesterday, the head of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran warned that Saturday was going to be their last day of taking to the streets. And so people are kind of worried about what we'll see next, and that they definitely seem to have a plan for a much fiercer crackdown on these protests. So, it's an interesting trend. We've seen so much far right stuff and we talk so much about the far right, and to see this expression, this continued expression for personal freedom, basically, and how this isn't going to be something it probably will not bring about democracy, but it's not going to be something very simple that the Iranian government can just squash. I think even with these harsher tactics, maybe the protests will be smaller or in different ways, but I think it's not going to be able to quash the movement itself.
No, it seems really remarkable. And I am hopeful for Iran's future. It would certainly, if you were able to eventually bring down that regime and have something closer to a democratic government, that would be enormous strategic victory for the United States.
Yeah. And the harsher, there is always the danger for governments because the harsher you are in the crackdowns, the more the public sentiment is against you.
Right.
And so it remains to be seen what happens here. But clearly, I think the government has stemmed its hand somewhat because of knowing that, not wanting to increase discontent from the public, but at the same time, just watching these protests grow is threatening their security. So it's definitely something to keep paying attention to, something to admire. I have the greatest admiration for these women and others who are protesting with them, knowing the danger to themselves and their families. Yeah. There have been several across the world. There have been several solidarity marches in Europe and Canada. Trudeau showed up to the Canadian one, I think, this week. We have trouble in the United States keeping momentum of protests when we're not an authority that's trying to stop them. So just this groundswell and these people just insisting on some basic freedom that they feel like they're owed, and sort of the waning of absolute authority. Obviously they can still exercise power, but it's definitely something that is challenging their power. And it will be important, I think, to see where this goes from here.
Yeah. That definitely very inspiring.
All right. Now we have a couple of elections to talk about, although I'm not sure UK really is an election, but it is a new prime minister.
Yeah. Well, I guess internal elections. So it seemed like last time we had just introduced Liz Truss as the new prime minister of the UK, talked about her not well thought out policies. And hey, sure enough, she was forced out because of the extreme reaction by financial markets was such a disaster that she announced her resignation after just 6 weeks. So I like the Economist quote, Ms. Truss is contender for the title of Britain's worst prime minister. On a damage done per day basis, she has no peers. So I think
but I mean, come on, Chamberlain. I mean, are you really there? I can think of a lot of really bad.
Day. Chamberlain was in there for a while.
I'm like, seriously.
But yeah, I agree. That's pretty bad when you beat Neville Chamberlain.
She doesn't. I mean, she had a really bad plan. I think that's ridiculous. And it's a sign of how UK media is towards
its own. The Economist. They're sober. This isn't like the Daily Mail or something.
No.
So, following some early contentions that maybe Boris Johnson would be back. He fortunately, in the challengers and the internal kind of Tory leadership selection process, dropped out. And Rishi Sunak, so the former finance minister under Boris Johnson,
who'd run against Truss.
Right, who ran against Truss in the original leadership. And he was also the one who kind of kicked off the collapse of the Johnson administration when he resigned following kind of all the controversy. So it took a little while for this to kind of pay out for him, but it's definitely paid out. So he emerged unchallenged. And I think this was seen as important because you had decision just among the MPs because everybody dropped out and running against him. And it never went to the greater party membership. I think that's how they ended up with Liz Truss in the first place, was because all the party members within Tories got to vote on it, which is hundreds of thousands of individuals. So, it was unique. Sunak is the first prime minister of South Asian descent within the UK, and he's a former Goldman Sachs banker. So he's much more kind of buttoned up and seen as more of a technocrat kind of in his viewpoint. So a lot more pragmatic. He's also the son of immigrants and husband to Ashkata Murty, who is actually the heiress to Infosys, which is one of the largest IT companies in the world. So his net worth is greater than the royal families of about 730 million pounds. So that's kind of unique, although I feel like we've had that experience before of plutocrats ruling.
We have, but Britain seems to.
Maybe
he's
Britain
also the youngest prime minister.
He's also the youngest, just 42. Which is unique. So the Economist made notes of his inexperience. So he's only had 7 years as an MP, but just the fact that they had so much purges within the Tory party around Brexit that allowed him to kind of rise to power at this very accelerated pace. So the markets have reacted positively to it. The yields fell on government bonds. There's not a lot of details on what he'll do exactly. I think his prescriptions for growth are mostly sensible from the Economist's take on it. In terms of investment, he's still talking about tax cuts, though. Nobody knows exactly how those tax cuts will be tailored. And he's also
cutting back on services, right?
But also essentially the new finance minister has already been asking for both defense, which I was surprised by, and health to cut 15% from their budgets. So that type of austerity is not going to make the Tories any more popular with voters, given the high energy prices and general suffering that the UK population is undergoing. So I think given this low growth rut that they're in, and unless they can turn things around, that Tories poll numbers will stay extremely low. And I think there's going to be more and more calls to have an early general election. That's going to get harder and harder to ignore over time. Because again, we talked about last time, they have the flexibility up through, I think, 2025 not to have a general election. But I think if it becomes so unpopular that they may be able to break that and be forced to to hold one, which actually would be the better thing given how dysfunctional the party is.
Yeah, I've been reading on that, though, that it's kind of crazy because normally you can't have one within 5 years. Like, it hasn't been that long since they had the last one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was 2018, 2019. Something like that, yeah. So in kind of wrapping this up, I did want to correct the earlier statement. So the budget cuts are targeting other agencies besides health and defense for those 15% cuts. So health and defense, which makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah. I thought you were going to mention that I pointed this out.
Yes, and Anita did point this out. So we wanted to make sure that was corrected before moving on to our last topic about Brazil. So that election is actually being held today as we speak. And as we mentioned last time, so this is the second round of the election between Lula and Bolsonaro. And polling has tightened up considerably. If you recall, in the first round of elections where you had, I think, 11 people total running, Lula had 48% of the vote. Bolsonaro came in at a surprising like 42 or 43%. Current polling has Lula with just a 4-point lead, so 52 to 48. So Bolsonaro has been running a campaign focused on getting, more of those swing voters to particularly focused on the state of Minas, which holds about 10% of the population within Brazil and kind of represents a microcosm. It's kind of what Ohio used to be in the United States, but isn't anymore. But it has like a mix. It models the national polling and national results.
Ethnically similar. You have the poverty level is similar overall because the region itself is very, very diverse.
Right.
So it has these diverse pockets. So I think it's still unlike Ohio in that respect.
Well, yeah.
Ohio is never diverse.
Well,
not like this. Not really to the same extent.
Not to that extent.
You had religious areas, you have less religious areas. And it's really quite striking how diverse this one.
Yeah, that's true. So I think, as this election has worn on, there's been a real focus on more ruthless type of attacks. And a lot of it is taking the signaling, I think, from U.S. elections and talking points, again, where this certain far-right thought process and language use kind of spreads around the world and affects other countries. So you have seen, it's really reached kind of the bottom of the gutter at this point in terms of the focus of the campaigns and how each candidate is framed. Lula, who I read was kind of viewed, by Bolsonaro's supporters the same way that Hillary is viewed by the Republicans and right here. So really a demonized figure. So that's gone to the point of, how corrupt he was, again, from ended up being without any facts is his conviction originally and jailing for 19 months around the Petrobras scandal during his original reign. But basically framing him as a corrupt, godless communist and a Satanist. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro is being framed as a fascist dictator, which is, closer to truth. But then a little definitely more out there as a pedophile and a cannibal based on his couple of quotes, which have been run in attack ads on Brazilian TVs, saying that, he's quoted as saying there was a spark between him and a 14-year-old Venezuelan girl. And then saying in a 2016 New York Times interview that he would like to eat an Indian. It was pretty clearly that he was joking and was referring to his willingness to engage in cannibalism with the indigenous tribe in the Amazon, of which the tribe itself has no history of engaging in cannibalism. So it's more kind of racism on his part. But you can just see this is kind of the stage of where the election has run. It's become enormously divisive within Brazil. And I was surprised there's been over 200 politically motivated attacks within the countries between July and September, and actually 21 deaths have been associated, strictly around this level of political toxicity, which you haven't seen in Brazil before, but exists now. There was a point this week, so the Washington Post actually reported that The Bolsonaro administration thought about postponing the election based on claims that the radio stations gave more airtime to Lula over Bolsonaro's campaign and violated Brazilian law, because I think they have that Fair Rights Act that the U.S. used to have in terms of each political ideology would get equal airtime. But key military leaders failed to back his plan. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he was already trying to pull the cards that we talked about in terms of like delaying election. Of course, all that remains true, that he's run a long campaign saying any result where he doesn't win is illegitimate. There's still the likelihood that if he does shown to be lose, that he'll refuse to lose office, that he'll try something similar to Trump on January 6th or worse. But it's not clear he would have the military support to have a successful coup.
Right, which is something we kind of talked about. So, yeah, I think, one thing that kind of stuck out to me is that previous to the runoffs, the right gained a majority in, right?
Yep.
And so if Bolsonaro wins, then you'll see an even stronger sort of far-right coalition, which will mean probably like further degradation of the rainforest.
Urbanization of Brazil too. So disassembling the democratic institutions.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'll see that. Whereas because of that, if Lula wins, then you'll see a more centrist government because he definitely will have too much challenges.
Be constrained, yeah.
And will kind of be part of the general trend then of the more leftist leaders in Latin and South America.
Yep. Yeah. So very important election. It'll be very telling to see how it goes.
Yeah, we keep having these shows like on election days, but unfortunately we won't know the results until you'll know the results before we will. So,
yep.
All right. Well, that is a very packed show.
It was. We covered a lot of good topics.
Yeah. So that was great. I guess this is what happens when we do it during daylight hours.
That's right.
I think that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, A.R. Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see our show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode. And leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.